Coming up in this episode of Real History, one of the most historically accurate films ever produced by Hollywood. April Fools. I just couldn't do it. Andy, our producer, wanted me to do a whole episode on the Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter with deadpan humor and be making up history and anecdotes to go along with the film's plot along the way. And I just couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it. There was something inside of me that just wouldn't allow me to do that. There would be a degree of irresponsibility to it all. And furthermore, some people just don't understand satire. So, in any case, what we're going to be taking a look at in this episode in recognition of April 1st is that we're going to be taking a look at Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, one of the ultimate pulp history action films ever. And one reason why I decided not to do the pure deadpan commentary throughout this episode is that there's actually a lot of fun nuggets to be discussing as we watch this film. So let's go ahead and get started and take a look at Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. Additionally, as an April 1st special, for anybody who leaves the best comment in the comments section below, we will provide you 2 free complimentary tickets to the Abraham Lincoln National Vampire Hunting Memorial and Museum, a place you definitely have to check out on your list.
Soaring speeches to quiet deeds. History remembers the battle and forgets the blood.
The fun little bit of history here right out of the gate is the fact that the Washington Monument was in fact, much like the Capitol Dome, incomplete during the time of the American Civil War. And even though it was incomplete, it was still the tallest structure in Washington, D.C. at that time, and it would not be completed until the year 1884.
I leave in your trusted hands, my dear friend Henry, this record that begins when I was just a boy.
Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky in the year 1809, and he was truly born in a state of abject poverty. And for this reason, his parents opt to move to Indiana when he is a very, very young man. We often think of Illinois as Lincoln's home. Kentucky claims him as their own, but it was in Indiana, truly, where he has some of these truly formative moments of his childhood. And here, too, it's one of the places where he was introduced to slavery. He was introduced to it as a young man. His father had a dislike for slavery, not because he was any sort of civil rights advocate, but because in the minds of people like the Lincolns who were living on the frontier, slavery was a form of competition. These were individuals who likewise were considered to be the lowest tiers of society. And as a result, Thomas Lincoln was opposed to slavery, but young Abraham also grew a distaste for it as well, because even as a young boy he saw something that was profoundly unfair about it.
You gotta do something.
Still get up.
Easy, child. Look away, Abraham.
Nancy Hanks Lincoln, famously an ancestor of actor Tom Hanks, does in fact pass away when Abraham Lincoln is 9 years old. It's not the devilish Jack Bart's the vampire that gets her, though, quite naturally. It is what was known as milk sickness, and this was something caused by white snake root plant, something that cows would eat. It was a form of poison that would get in their systems. It would be shared through the milk that was then consumed by humans who milked those cows. And this is what leads to Nancy Hanks Lincoln's death in 1818. And it left a void in Abraham Lincoln's life that could never quite be fulfilled thereafter.
My light was gone.
I don't know.
Abraham, you promised me
promise me you won't go and do anything foolish?
Thomas Lincoln actually lived several decades past his wife, Nancy. He lived until the year 1851, but the relationship between Thomas and his son, later become president of the United States, was always a cold one. They were very distant. They often did not communicate as active as many fathers and sons might. There was a definite strain after this pillar. His mother had departed the family all too soon.
So, where's Henry?
Yes, sir. We've been looking all over, sir. Searching high and low.
Low's more likely. Just find him, Hearts. Oh, and send a fresh crop south. We have a lot of mouths to feed.
Ah, those dastardly slavers. Ah.
From my mother.
Lincoln claimed to have no talent in regard to the handling of firearms. It was not something that he was very adept at. And really, his true talent was in book learning, was absorbing information. I don't think he had much of a taste for using firearms, and he sought to solve problems through other means when it came to his personal life.
There are two kinds of men, Mr. Lincoln. Those that have the guts to pull the trigger, and those who do not.
When Lincoln was actually challenged to a duel by one James Shields, who later becomes a political acquaintance of his, Lincoln's weapon of choice was broadswords, cavalry broadswords, because he believed that his height and his arm length would give him a definite advantage in that regard. And so that never really came to fruition, but it just goes to show his style of thinking, and thinking outside the box, I would say. Yes. I don't even know what to say.
Which one takes your fancy?
Actually, I haven't had the best of luck with shooting irons. But, I was a rail splitter.
The popular notion of Abraham Lincoln being a so-called rail splitter more so emerges during his 1860 campaign for the presidency, and this is something meant to give him a sort of grassroots appeal, a man of the people, somebody who literally cleared his own path in life. There's very much this populist idea and image behind him as the rail splitter. And here we see that idea being turned on its head so he can slay the undead with lethal efficiency.
I give you the targets. That was our deal. This is not only about Jack Bartz. Fedoma, a ruthless enforcer, and her brother.
I've seen him before.
I love the little bit of historical context here with the makeshift PowerPoint slides that our vampire friend has in the works here. It's some fascinating counterpoint history that in some ways covers up the notions of manifest destiny, which were some of the real driving factors behind westward expansion and a lot of the victims of it.
There is one rule, Mr. Lincoln. I was recently forced to part ways with a thieving prick of an associate.
Man, that's such a great line. You think people in the 19th century would have said that? I don't know.
And am therefore in need of a replacement. There's a room upstairs. It isn't much, but I suppose it could be had on credit if the tenant were willing to work here in return.
Lincoln arrives in Springfield, which is the brand new Illinois capital. He does so in April of 1837. And as the film shows, he sublets an apartment that is above the store, the general store of Joshua Speed. Joshua Speed becomes a lifelong friend of Abraham Lincoln. Later on, when Lincoln is president, he tries to give Speed a number of jobs and professional positions within his administration. Speed flatly refuses. Perhaps one reason why that is so is that he didn't want politics to compromise their friendship, because Speed actually came from a slave-owning, pro-slavery family in Kentucky. Speed never quite overcame that attachment to that Southern way of life, and despite all of that, he remains loyal to the Union and fiercely loyal to Abraham Lincoln himself. All that said, James Speed, Joshua Speed's brother, does go on to serve as U.S. Attorney General under the Lincoln administration, and so Lincoln couldn't quite escape the Speed family in that regard.
I mean, miss. I'm Abraham. Lincoln.
Mary Todd.
Mary Todd Lincoln came to Springfield in October 1839. Perhaps she was looking for a gentleman suitor. She was looking on moving up in the world. Much like Speed, she comes from a Kentucky slave-owning family, and she is very adept. She is very smart. She works her way through the upper circles of society. She mingles with politicians, and she can squarely debate any of them. She becomes a major driving force. She knows politics. She has the insider knowledge on all of it. This is the way that she had grown up, and she becomes a professional compass for her future husband in consequence.
Stephen Douglas, how do you do?
Abraham. Lincoln.
Are you a voting man, Mr. Lincoln?
The dynamic of Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln is in some ways the perfect dynamic of frenemy, as we would say today. These two men who are in many ways politically different. They compete with one another for various political positions and attachments. Most famously, they square off in a series of 7 debates in 1858 for the Illinois Senate seat, but that does not destroy their friendship, interestingly enough. Perhaps there's something we can learn in this regard. Ah, first blood.
It can quickly disappear.
How appropriate that we have this vampire sympathetic to slavery counting his money in the bank safe. It's important to point out that by the time Abraham Lincoln is elected President of the United States, slavery, from a monetary perspective, was worth more than all of the financial institutions, all of the railroads, all the forms of commerce, everything except the land itself in America. Nothing surpassed the value of slavery itself. This is why it becomes such a hot button issue. It is not only about the buying and selling of human property as forced labor, but the destiny of a continent is at stake here as well. And that is why Abraham Lincoln goes out to slay the undead at night. Out of all the ways that Abraham Lincoln kills vampires, that one may be my favorite. Putting the guy in the fires of the forge, lighting him up.
However, personal liberty laws state that anyone who is born free cannot be taken under this act.
I heard a good woman once say, until all men are free, we're all slaves.
Will Johnson?
William Johnson was in fact a real person. He was born in 1833. He hailed from a family that was originally enslaved. He eventually works his way, like a lot of these other characters, to Springfield, Illinois, but unlike what the movie says, he and Lincoln were not childhood friends. It really wasn't until the eve of the Civil War, as Abraham Lincoln was getting more involved in national politics, that William Johnson was hired as his valet. And Johnson will follow Lincoln to some of the most famous locations, battlegrounds, and speeches of the American Civil War in forthcoming years. More on that to come.
Gentlemen, I'm sure we can work this out.
Now, I suggest you walk away, son.
No, sir. I suggest you do.
Get up!
What we see here in this scuffle on the street actually happened with a degree of frequency in some northern states, because the Fugitive Slave Law, which had been reinforced in the year 1850, allowed slavers to go into northern states that had outlawed slavery within their own borders. And what these individuals were able to do is that they were able to reclaim their missing property. And sometimes local residents would try to intervene. Not only would some participate in clandestine measures on the Underground Railroad, but they would actually get in scuffles with these overseers, these bounty hunters, these slavers that came up into northern states. There's a really fascinating episode that I've been looking at lately that happens in the year 1855 in Hollidaysburg, Pennsylvania, where a freedom-seeking man of color by the name of Jacob Green, who had fled his plantation that he was on in Virginia, it had made it that far north into central Pennsylvania. The nephew of his owner catches up with him, and the townspeople intervene, and they create a riot, and they help this man escape. And Jacob Green is never heard from ever again, and presumably he makes his way to freedom. So these sorts of encounters did happen.
Voice like that's too strong to be stuck keeping shop.
I'm actually studying to be a lawyer.
Ah, well, Mr. Lincoln, maybe it's time you thought about politics. I can connect you with the right people.
Thank you, Senator Nolan.
Senator Nolan is a fictional character, but one wonders, is he a good vampire? Here he is wearing sunglasses. It leads to this speculation, are there other vampires amongst us? When this movie originally came out in 2012, I went and saw it in theaters in 3D. There's no way I wasn't going to see this movie in 3D. Hopefully I drank a little bit beforehand. That probably would have made it even more entertaining. But this was like cutting edge technology of its time. And this was a $100 million budget. This wasn't simply, didn't have a B picture budget, even though many people consider it to be a B picture. So say what you will about the absurdity of the plot, but there's some really cool special effects in this movie.
There's thousands of us here. You won't stop till this whole country's ours.
All the vampire stuff aside, many Northerners saw this evil plot that was gripping America's potential in the mid-19th century. Many people call it the slave powers conspiracy. And the whole philosophy behind it is that slaveholding Southerners have a monopoly on every institution of federal power. A majority of Supreme Court justices owned slaves. Southerners often had control of both houses as well as the White House for many years. And so this idea that you can't stop us, reflected here in the form of vampires, was also very much felt in regard to national politics, that there is this evil that is toxic for America's future. In this regard, the slavers and the vampires are perfect allies.
And to you, Abraham.
Abraham and Mary Todd married on November 4th, 1842. And I think it's safe to say that it's one of the most consequential marriages in American history. I think it's as consequential as the marriage of Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt as well. In some manner, through some means, these were two individuals who were able to complement one another in order to propel each other and achieve great things in the process. Incredible matching when you think about it. But they were, in fact, married in Springfield in Mary Todd's sister's home, Elizabeth Edwards. You can see that home, known as Edwards Place, today in Springfield, Illinois, as a historic site. So when you go see the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, go check out Edwards Place as well.
People getting killed every day. Slaves disappearing. Some people talk about monsters and demons.
There's, of course, many fantastical hypotheticals to be found in this movie. I think one of the most interesting is, what if Abraham Lincoln and Harriet Tubman had been able to meet at some point in their careers in political exchanges? To my knowledge, I don't think they ever did meet. All in all, though, I think Abraham Lincoln would have been of the mind that, well, he would have been very impressed with Harriet Tubman, I think, in the same way that he would have been impressed with Frederick Douglass, as he was on the number of occasions that they met. And even though Abraham Lincoln was not without prejudice, at least by our standards of today, Frederick Douglass recalled of him that he treated him on equal terms, that he treated him with the dignity that he deserved when he went and conversed with him at the White House.
I have seen this horror of the South firsthand.
I say the need for peace outweighs the needs of the blacks. I say that if the people of this great nation want slavery, then let them have it.
Stephen Douglas was in favor of a policy that was known as popular sovereignty as slavery was spreading. And the idea behind that was, in his mind, a democratic principle that let people moving into these new territories be able to determine their own destiny. Do they want slavery to exist in that new land, that new territory? Would it become a state? How would it disrupt the balance of power? Douglas thought, let the people decide. And at face value, that seemed like a very fair assumption on his part. Abraham Lincoln was of the mind, though, you can't have something that is predicated upon injustice, such as slavery, be determined by something that is just, like the notion of democracy. And so it was all about false equivalencies in Lincoln's mind, and he was quick to call out Douglas as a result.
But I began at last to see it another. To see and to feel the even greater.
Don't you absolutely wish you could have seen Abraham Lincoln swinging an axe like that, like some sort of martial arts hero? Would have been incredible. Oh man, this movie brings about all sorts of what ifs. You gotta love it for what it is. It's the best entrance of a cinematic Abraham Lincoln that we have ever seen. He is presented here as the true American action hero, with Anthony Mackie at his side, no less. And this movie, I think it's helpful for no other reason that it's a very unique cultural product. We've come a long way in the 100 years since the birth of a nation. When you think back to the earliest cinematic representations of the American Civil War, the slave-holding South and the Confederacy was often depicted by filmmakers as something that was virtuous, something that was noble. And then here you are a century later with the likes of Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, showing them as the antithesis of all of that. They are corrupt. They are morally bankrupt. They are allying themselves with the undead to perpetuate a kingdom of slavery and injustice. This movie tells us something about how people are beginning to assess and examine Civil War history in the 2010s. Think on it. So it's actually a pretty cool depiction of Lincoln's first inaugural, which took place in March of 1861. If for no other reason, you get a sense of scale. 15,000 people gathered at the steps of the Capitol. And they listened to a speech, those that can hear him, of a conciliatory Lincoln, who very famously calls upon Americans to look upon and find the better angels of their nature. He's saying that we've been through hard times before. Let's not ruin it with the specter of civil war. But in the eyes of the Confederates, Lincoln's election was a bridge too far, and they didn't want to abide by the perfectly legal results of a presidential election. Does that sound familiar? We're here taken through a hodgepodge of various Civil War scenes, a kind of cool depiction of Fort Sumter is something that you don't often see in cinematic representations of the war, followed by all of these sort of generic Civil War combat scenes. And hey, you know, it is what it is.
I'm trying to protect the freedom of a nation.
It's also fun to point out that this movie comes out just a few months before Steven Spielberg's movie Lincoln does. And so Lincoln was very much in vogue in 2012 when you have these two different sides of him. The smart, cunning, calculative politician on the Spielberg end, and then the slayer of vampires in the other. Two very different interpretations, I think we shall say.
Is truly a stand against evil, then let it stand for something. If it is a war for the freedom of man, why not give all men a reason to fight it?
Here too is a pretty cool representation of the congressional chambers during the Civil War. The problem here, though, is that Abraham Lincoln never delivered a speech in this environment. George Washington and John Adams gave their State of the Union addresses in person. Thomas Jefferson opted to discontinue that, and that remained the norm until Woodrow Wilson was in office in the 1910s. And so a century and a half went by, including Abraham Lincoln's tenure, in which the president had delivered his State of the Union address to the Congress and likewise distributed to the people, but he did not deliver it himself.
All persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then,
and henceforward shall be free.
And here with Lincoln uttering some of the words of the Emancipation Proclamation, we hear one of the few inspiring phrases within it, and that is the phrase, "forever free." When you read the Emancipation Proclamation, it is not like the Gettysburg Address. It is neither like any of his inaugural speeches as well. It is a practical, descriptive war measure that nonetheless becomes foundational for all civil rights legislation during Reconstruction, during the Civil War itself, that will follow. So, democracy, it's often baby steps.
What's your name?
Lily.
And your father? What's his?
Abraham.
Oh, Venoma, that heathen. In reality, Willie Lincoln passed away from typhoid fever in 1862. And it's all likely that he drank polluted water. Washington, D.C. was known as this very unhealthy place, even beyond the political spectrum. It didn't have good sanitation. It didn't have good water. It was literally built on top of this bogland decades earlier, and they were still working out some of the problems. And one of the side effects of that was unclean water, from which people often became ill. And unfortunately, this is in reality what claimed Willie Lincoln's life. And it was something that plunged Mary Todd into the deep depths of depression, from which she would never fully recover. And a lot of people give a lot of grief to Mary Todd Lincoln, which I think is completely unfounded. They call her crazy. They write her off as some sort of maniac who limited her husband's ability to be an effective president in some regards, which is so profoundly unfair. Because here is a woman that loses 3 of her sons and her husband before she passes away. How can something like that not affect you emotionally?
We must stop this war. Willie's death is just the beginning.
Don't you dare say his name.
I warned you.
Both Speed and Lincoln, in their younger years, as well as I suspect during Lincoln's White House years, suffered from depression. They had these emotional challenges that they always had to be confronting, and I think along those lines they served as a good support system for each other. And when I tell students that Abraham Lincoln battled depression in his life, he had all these personal hurdles to overcome, I think that lends itself to a degree of empathy. When the person who's on the $5 bill, on the penny, he's in marble and in monuments, when you recognize the fact that he was in fact human, this movie portrays him as a vampire killing superhero. But all in all, he had to contend with a lot of the same issues that things like you and I have to put up with. And the fact that he was able to achieve all that he did while confronting those inner struggles, it makes it all that more incredible as a result.
Union troops are flooding onto the field. We are now outnumbered and ill-equipped compared to the North.
Fun little bit of Hollywood trivia. The actor who was playing Jefferson Davis in this movie, a gentleman by the name of John Rothman, also is in the movie Gettysburg, and he plays U.S. General John F. Reynolds. And so here we see him on two opposite sides of the spectrum between these two very different Civil War movies. A comedic little admission here. I was working at Gettysburg National Military Park when this movie came out, and there was considerable excitement in our ranks at work among the Rangers staff because we knew that this was just going to be a darn good time. And there were 30 of us, 30 park rangers from Gettysburg National Military Park that went to see this movie in 3D together. And you should have heard the Keller commentary being narrated as we were sitting there watching it. And to an extent, I think we were disturbing the other handful of spectators who were there to see the movie. But maybe that's one reason why I have a little bit of sentimentality to this. It's not just because of the movie itself, but the really good time I had with some friends and colleagues who went to see it with me. Suffice it to say, though, when we saw Gettysburg showing up on the map here in these battle scenes, we perked up even more and led to some more fun conversations within the theater.
First day of Gettysburg. It's been a disaster.
The first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, because he was so smart, he knew that there were going to be two more after that. Great foresight Abraham Lincoln had.
That is a lot of silver, Abe. Now, how are we going to get all this there?
As all of the silver is being melted here to help kill off the vampire leagues. I do kind of like this little scene of the industrial North, because the Civil War is as much a war, like other wars that would follow it, it's as much about the assembly lines as it is about the battle lines. And of course, this is one of the big advantages that northern states have as the Civil War's being waged. But ultimately, all of this extra material, all of this industrialization, it doesn't mean squat if you don't have good generals who can win you victories on the battlefield. And ultimately, that latter aspect, good generalship, is how the United States is going to pull this off and win in reality.
It's 80 miles from here to Gettysburg. 80 miles will decide whether this nation belongs to the living or the dead.
For as cool a shot as this is, the pocket watch turning into the funnel of steam coming out of the locomotive, the actual route to Gettysburg, one that Lincoln would take a few months later when he gives the Gettysburg Address, is far more circuitous. You have to go north out of Washington, you have to cut across east, you have to go through Harrisburg, you have to make a number of transfers along the way. It wasn't quite as clear-cut a route as we are led to believe right here, but it's a cool shot, it's a cool looking map for as exaggerated as it is. The weapon here that Will Johnson is using is known as the 1858 Star Revolver. And so this fits within this category of new weapons that are being experimented with as the Civil War is about to unfold. But its great flaw is that the triggers tended to break, and it received a lot of complaints from troops in combat. So perhaps it wouldn't have been the best revolver to use while you're trying to defend the president from the undead. Okay, I don't care who you are or what you say. This is just a fun, cool movie showing Abraham Lincoln doing cool action movie stuff. So what's not to like? Is it disrespectful? Is it distasteful? Maybe. The truth of the matter is that Lincoln had a really good sense of humor himself. Maybe he himself would have enjoyed this movie. I don't know. The burning railroad bridge that we see here, I think, is actually a pretty good composite of a real-life Civil War era bridge, or one like it. The one that comes to mind was known as the Beanpole and Cornstalk Bridge, which ran over Potomac Creek during the Civil War and was heavily used by the United States Military Railroad. The role of the railroad in the American Civil War is something not to be overlooked. You had geniuses such as the likes of General Herman Haupt, director of the U.S. Military Railroad, who is truly one of the great orchestrators, one of the great logisticians of the American Civil War, and people like him should get credit more often. Damn, that's one powerful locomotive. That's quite the grade that it's working up here.
Always have a contingency plan.
Hit me low! Bayonets, bayonets for Springfield muskets! Springfield muskets!
Ah, so that's how the Army of the Potomac is able to turn the tide on July 2nd and 3rd, 1863 at Gettysburg. Who would have thought? Yeah, you go, Mary Todd.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent.
It's a very baritone delivery of the Gettysburg Address, but it's Daniel Day-Lewis's performance in Lincoln, which comes out the same year as this film, I think accurately reflects. Lincoln had a high-pitched, squeaky, Kentucky twang voice, I think is the best way for us to describe it. And so a far cry from what we get in this scene or the Gregory Peck style of delivery that we see in a lot of earlier films.
The unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced.
There's a few interesting little details in these Gettysburg Address scenes. There were a lot of people there for the cemetery dedication on November 19th, 1863 on Cemetery Hill. And they even have the tent in the background, which you can see in some of the photographs. And the reason that that tent was there is that Edward Everett, the main orator of the day, well, he had been having some bowel issues, and he needed a comfort tent in which he might need to relieve himself before, during, or after his 2-hour oration that precedes Abraham Lincoln's 2.5-minute speech. So it's funny, the little things that they put in here. But where's the cemetery? There's no burials in this burial ground. So, yeah, you get some things right, you get some things wrong here in your horror movies.
Our enemies have made their exodus. Some back to Europe, some to South America and the Orient.
One sad anecdote pertaining to Lincoln's trip to Gettysburg is that both he and Will Johnson had a mild form of smallpox, in all likelihood, during their visit to Gettysburg. Tad Lincoln, who doesn't even exist in this movie, was suffering from smallpox, in November of 1863. Mary Todd Lincoln didn't want Lincoln to go to Gettysburg, but Lincoln, realizing the gravity of the situation, and despite the fact that presidents often didn't leave Washington in this era or prior, he is nonetheless compelled to go to Gettysburg. But he is a very sickly, weak individual as he is doing so. It is at this time, or shortly thereafter, Will Johnson also gets smallpox, and that is ultimately what kills him just 2 months later in January of 1864. And I think something that is very telling and that is very profound about this relationship between Lincoln and Johnson is that Johnson is buried in Arlington National Cemetery despite the fact that he is a civilian. And on his tombstone are the simple words, William H. Johnson, citizen. Very telling for something from the Civil War era. The future of the country, perhaps.
Mary, darling, have you seen my hat?
On your desk in the office.
One of the unique things about the two Lincoln films that come out in 2012 is that they both start to conclude with similar themes. Herein, they both reflect on Abraham Lincoln's supposed forgetfulness. Here we are in the final scenes of the movies, and he's forgetting his hat, he's forgetting his gloves, he's being beckoned to the theater because they're going to be late. And so despite the fact that these are two wildly different cinematic depictions of Abraham Lincoln, it's interesting to see that they start to close the show by showing this one aspect of Lincoln.
One more. A guy only gets that drunk when he wants to kiss a girl or kill a man. So which is it?
And so the ending here begs the question, who will be the next great American leader to occupy the White House, and what vampire is going to spur him to that greatness in the long run? Some fun and creative end titles that we see here as well. A landscape soaked with blood, perhaps, is the message here that we walk away with. But Abraham Lincoln is the one that makes it all happen through his superhuman skills. So once again, we couldn't think of a better film to reflect upon for an April 1st special. It is what it is. It is a corny yet fun historical action horror film. There's no way around it. But like I said, there are these fun historical nuggets that one can nonetheless find within the script. And of course, the novel upon which the movie is based goes even more in depth into some of these characterizations. As we always do here on Real History, I like to give reading recommendations. And there's a really fun, lighthearted book about Abraham Lincoln that I think is rather appropriate for this movie. And it's called Did Lincoln Own Slaves? And in this book, a Lincoln historian who has worked at Abraham Lincoln historical sites collects some of the best questions that he has gotten from visitors about what Abe Lincoln did and did not do both before and during his presidency. Perhaps a later edition of the book would include the question, did he in fact kill vampires? But if you're looking for a really fun, more lighthearted read on Abraham Lincoln that won't be a slog to get through, check out the book, Did Lincoln Own Slaves? You won't regret it. But in all seriousness, once again, thank you for tuning in to Real History. We welcome you to check out our various website and resources, likewise available below the caption underneath this video. As always, we appreciate your support. Read up, stay curious, and keep those axes sharpened. See you next time on Real History. I can't do the deadpan thing. I just can't do it.